Tom, he watched. He documented. He kept every newspaper clipping, every article, every photo. He tracked their lives from a distance, seeing patterns they couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Until finally, as 2024 approached, he knew it was time for the truth to surface. None of them had spoken to each other in years, except Sarah, who somehow maintained connections with them all, but they remembered their pact. And as December 31st, 2024 approached, they each received a simple message from Tom. Just a photo of their teenage selves standing around a freshly buried box and coordinates to the old baseball field. Everyone remember the pact? Sarah pulled her coat tighter, breath fogging in the cold. We'd open at New Year's Eve, 2024, no matter what. Michael checked his Rolex. Can we get on with this? Some of us have places to be. Still a dick, David muttered, just loud enough to hear. He hadn't looked at Michael since they'd arrived, hadn't spoken to any of them in years except Sarah. Rachel knelt by the spot, brushing away dead leaves. The marker stone should be here. Her fingers found the edge of the flat rock they had used to mark the burial site. Tom, you brought the shovel, right? Tom nodded, quiet as ever, and started digging. He'd been the one to suggest burying the time capsule back in '99, though none of them could quite remember whose idea the Polaroids had been. The metal box emerged from the earth like a secret refusing to stay buried. Sarah brushed dirt from its surface, revealing the words they'd scratched into the lid. Y2K time capsule. Open December 31st, 2024, The Breakfast Club. God, we were pretentious. Rachel laughed, but it sounded forced. Michael's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, frowning. Look, can we just... Your company can survive an hour without you, Sarah snapped. You owe us that much at least. The word company hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah pulled out a Swiss Army knife, the same one they'd used to scratch their message into the lid all those years ago. The hinges creaked as she worked them loose. Inside, 5 Polaroid photos lay on top, partially obscuring notes and trinkets beneath. Each photo showed one of them as teenagers, faces full of certainty about the futures they'd planned. God, look how young we were. Sarah picked up the first photo. Michael in his Letterman jacket, that cocky smile unchanged by time. She turned it over absently, then froze. Wait, what is this? What? Michael reached for the photo. Sarah's voice shook as she read, Fortune 500 CEO by 40, lives in glass tower overlooking Atlanta. Everything he touches turns to gold. The cost is higher than he thinks. Michael's smile faltered slightly. That's not... We didn't write those. Rachel grabbed her photo, flipping it over. Her younger self wore a Yale sweatshirt, already dreaming of medical school. Her hands trembled as she read the back. Discovers breakthrough treatment. Loses everything to prove it works. Truth buried under profit. Watches others pay the price. The color drained from her face. How did you know? She looked at Tom, but he just stared at the ground, shoulders hunched against the December wind. Jessica snatched her photo next, hands shaking. Her teenage self beamed from the center of a crowd, yearbook in her hands. She flipped it, already knowing she'd find something written there. Builds network for the sick and dying. Connects thousands seeking hope. Watches his options disappear one by one. Their blood on his hands. The treatment centers, she whispered, looking up at Michael. All those people, that was you. Years of suspicion crystallized into certainty. Sarah stared at her own photo. Her teenage self leaning against her father's hardware store, rolling her eyes at having to work there. Her hands trembled as she turned it over. Stays when she meant to leave. Pays debts that aren't hers. Watches father die waiting for approval. Keeps his promises anyway. Dad's heart attack, Sarah's voice cracked. The claim denial... It was your company? Michael straightened his tie, a nervous habit from board meetings. Look, Lifeguard has policies. I don't personally review... 6 months of appeals, Sarah's voice cracked, each time with a different excuse. More documentation needed. Under review. Pending approval. Until finally. She met Michael's eyes. Did you know your company has a term for it? Death by delay. It's right there in the internal memos. My daughter. David's voice cut through the cold air. He hadn't touched his photo yet. It lay in the box, face down, like an accusation waiting to be read. David, I never knew it, Michael started. 8 years old. David's words fell like stones. The treatment existed, it worked, but your company... He finally reached for his photo, the last one. Don't, Michael said softly. The Polaroid showed David in the art room, paint splattered and smiling, a lifetime before cancer took his little girl. No one breathed as he turned it over. David stared at the back of his photo, his hands shaking so badly Sarah had to read it for him. Paints portraits of the dying. Watches his daughter fade. Begs for treatment that exists. Learns how cheap a life can be. $300,000, David's voice shook. That's what the treatment would have cost your company. 1/4 bonus for you. But your company said it wasn't cost-effective to cover experimental treatments, didn't it? Even when the data showed that they worked? Michael took a step back. The treatment wasn't approved yet. The liability? It worked in Europe! Rachel cut in. I had the data, the studies. Mortality rates dropped by 83% in the trial groups. Your company didn't just bury my research, you made sure no one would fund similar studies. How many children died while you were protecting your profits? You don't understand, Michael's voice cracked. The shareholders. Shareholders? Jessica laughed bitterly. I watched my support groups empty out one by one. Treatment centers closing, medications are becoming unavailable. Every time I tried to help people find options, your company was there, closing doors. Sarah picked up her father's photo again. He waited 6 months for approval, 6 months of appeals while his heart got weaker. The stress alone. Tom moved quietly during their confrontation, unnoticed as always. He pulled something from the box, the Polaroid camera they'd used 25 years ago. You want to know the real cost? David stepped toward Michael. Come see her room, still exactly how she left it. Her art supplies, her stuffed animals, her... His voice broke. Her Christmas presents, and I never got to give her. The flash of Tom's camera startled them all. The camera whirred, spitting out a fresh Polaroid. Tom waited for it to develop, his face unreadable as the others turned to stare at him. What are you doing? Sarah asked, but Tom just watched the image appear. Dark at first, then clearing, all of them caught in that moment of confrontation. David's grief and rage, Michael's fear, the others' dawning horror at how their lives had twisted together. Without a word, Tom placed the new photo face down in the disturbed earth. Something metal glinted as he set it atop the photograph. A revolver, old but well-maintained. Tom? Michael's voice shook. What is this? Tom stepped back, looked at each of them in turn. For the first time all evening, he spoke. Some predictions right themselves. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the growing dark. Sarah moved first, reaching for the photo. Rachel grabbed her wrist. Wait. David stared at the gun, then at Michael. What does it say? Don't, Rachel pleaded. We don't have to... Read it! David's voice was eerily calm. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up the photo, careful not to touch the gun. She turned it over. 2 names were written in Tom's precise handwriting, followed by a time. Michael or David, 11:59 p.m. 1 bullet ends it all. The winter wind rustled through dead leaves, carrying the distant sound of New Year's celebrations. In just a few minutes, the prediction would either come true, or someone would choose to break the pattern. The gun waited, cold and patient in the growing dark. $300,000, David's voice shook with rage. That's what my daughter's life was worth to your company. To you. You don't understand corporate liability. Michael straightened his tie again, his CEO mask slipping back into place. The treatment wasn't approved. The risks. Risks? David stepped forward. My 8-year-old daughter was dying. What risk could be worse than that? The company had policies. Policies! David's laugh was hollow. You wrote the policies, Michael! You made the rules that killed her! Michael's face hardened. Maybe if you'd had better insurance, or if you'd noticed the symptoms sooner. Don't you dare! David's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Don't you dare try to blame me for this! I'm just saying. As a father, you had options, second mortgages, loans. Michael's corporate mask cracked slightly, desperation seeping through. You could have found the money if you'd really tried. The words hung in the air like poison. Found the money? David's hands clenched into fists. I sold everything, my car, my studio, my parents' wedding rings. I begged your company. And your company. His voice broke. Sent me a form letter. We regret to inform you. It wasn't personal. Michael took a step back, glancing at the gun. David, you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking clearer than I have in years. David's grief crystallized into something harder, colder. You let her die to protect your profit margins. That's not... Michael's hand moved toward the gun, fear finally breaking through his corporate veneer, David racing him to it. The Polaroid camera whirred suddenly, startling them all. No one had touched it, but somehow it was taking one final picture. The shot rang out across the baseball field, echoing off the old oak tree. "No!" Sarah's scream cut through the night. "Oh, God, no!" Rachel's hands flew to her mouth. "What have you done? You monster!" Jessica's reporter's instinct made her watch as the Polaroid slowly developed in the winter air, even as tears streamed down her face. The image emerged gradually. First shadows, then shapes, then... The wind caught the photo before it fully developed, carrying it away into the darkness. Behind them, the New Year's bells began to toll midnight. Tom's final prediction had written itself.